Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Geneva. This week's briefing, we have a focus on cargo. And so, as usual, we have Brian Pierce, who's our chief economist, and he will give us an overview of how the cargo side of the business is doing. And then we have a special appearance by Glenn Hughes, who's our global head of cargo, to outline some of the challenges that the cargo side of the business is facing. And then, as usual, we'll throw it open to questions and answers via the chat function. So with that, I'll hand over to Brian to take us through the overview of the cargo industry. Just give us 1 second.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. And good day to everybody. Obviously, the industry today finds itself in a situation where the international passenger business is effectively closed, as you can see from the exceptionally weak level of passenger kilometres flown on international markets. Cargo is perhaps one of the few bright spots that we're seeing in this very difficult environment. And as you can see, cargo was hit, at least cargo volumes, cargo traffic, was hit much less than the passenger business. By July, we saw cargo tonne kilometres flown just over 13% lower than a year earlier. If we look at what's happened by trade lane, interestingly, there's huge variation from actually the North Pacific market, which is showing volumes actually higher than where they were last year, versus the North Atlantic, where volumes are 30% down. Now, there's partly a cargo demand reason for this. If we look at trade flows in July, the US was actually with China, US trade with China was down less than 1% compared to US trade with Germany, which was down by 13%. So that's part of the reason, but it certainly doesn't explain the extent of these differences, which we think are much more related to the shortage of freighter capacity. And that's rather a theme of this presentation. The demand for cargo has actually been driven as economies have unlocked, as governments have unlocked their economies. We've obviously not seen that happening with borders for travel, but borders are open for trade, and as economies have unlocked and people have returned to work, we've seen this tremendous rebound in business confidence. Business confidence, and obviously this is the confidence of businesses largely outside of the airline sector, is back to where it was pre-crisis in most of the major economies around the world. Effectively, we've had a V-shaped recovery in business confidence. And if we look at the overall confidence of manufacturers, who are a critical driver for air cargo, you can see from the red line that their confidence has rebounded very sharply. And you can also see that has been related very closely with the growth of output for the manufacturing sector, more broadly GDP growth. So what that's telling us is that there's likely to be a V-shaped recovery in economic output. That's good for cargo demand. Unfortunately, that would in normal times be good for business travel. And we know, unfortunately, that businesses are not travelling at the moment. But it certainly is good news for cargo. And what we think is happening is actually that cargo is following a sort of fairly typical recession recovery cycle. Unlike the air passenger business, clearly the passenger business has been hit by an unprecedented shock, and international travel's down over 90%. you can see here that the pattern, which this shows the share of air cargo in total world trade. And as you can see, in a recession period, the blue bars, air's share collapses essentially as shippers turn away from air to other modes of transport. But in a recovery period for the world economy, which is what we're entering now, typically companies turn to air as their preferred mode of transport to get inventory, to get components to production facilities as quickly as possible to supply recovering demand. And as you can see, the last couple of months have been consistent with that. Air cargo has increased its share of world trade. So we think we're entering a sort of reasonably positive environment for air cargo demand. And if we look at what's been happening to export orders, that also supports the view that in the next couple of months we're likely to see a further improvement in air cargo traffic volumes from the sort of minus 13% that we had in July. But I think one of the major issues for the cargo business is that although demand is recovering, there's a real shortage of capacity, and in particular, there's a real shortage of freighter capacity. And if we look at how the cargo has been carried on the major trade lanes, the Pacific, it's actually the North Pacific, Asia to Europe, the North Atlantic, and within Asia, which is a key market because Asia is the manufacturing center of the world. You can see the importance of freighters. In the Pacific, 90% of cargo has been carried on freighters. And you'll notice that ordering is very similar to the success and the strength or otherwise of cargo volumes on those various markets. They're strongest in the Pacific, weakest in the North Atlantic and Asia. And the problem is a lack of freighter capacity in some of those markets, given that the passenger fleet, which would typically carry 50% of cargo, has been grounded. And if we look at what's happening to the capacity side of the cargo business, clearly the freighter fleet is being utilised, probably as much as it can be, given the rise in daily hours that we've seen happen over the last few months. Record highs in the hours freighter aircraft are in the air serving the demand. The problem has been the grounding of the passenger fleet, particularly wide-body aircraft, which are typically used on longer-haul passenger services. And recall that we think that the longer-haul markets are likely to be the last to open up to international air travel. There clearly has been some use of passenger aircraft for cargo, but that's still a serious constraint. And what we've seen happen is overall cargo capacity is down enormously. The red line shows that there's been some recovery as freighters have been utilised more and as we've got a few wide-body aircraft returning to service. But essentially, cargo capacity is still between 30 and 40% down on where it was before. Now, in any market where there's such a severe shortage of capacity, prices rise, and so cargo yields have been quite a bit higher than they would normally be, and that's driving cargo revenues for airlines and providing quite an important source of revenues in an environment where the main business, the passenger business, has virtually disappeared. And if we look at what that means for the industry as a whole, it means that actually the cargo business is becoming more important because it is providing a partial offset to the collapse in passenger revenues that we've seen. Cargo was a declining proportion of airline revenues pre-crisis. We think for the next year or so, it's likely to be much more significant. Unfortunately, not significant enough to offset the continued weakness on passenger markets and with passenger revenues. So this is certainly not something that's going to come to the rescue of the industry in its current difficult position. But certainly for some long-haul markets, for some airlines, cargo revenues may fill the gap that's being left by the absence of business revenues, which previously drove profitability. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Brian. Now I'd like to turn over to Glyn Hughes, who will give a short presentation before we open up for questions. So, Glyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and hello to everybody out there. Thank you, Brian, for presenting a very clear picture of the current financial state of the industry. But Brian also extremely eloquently described the role of air cargo during times of economic expansion. And when you consider that air cargo typically would transport about 30 to 35% of international trade by value, even though that represents less than about 1% of total volumes, it still is about $6 to $7 trillion worth of goods. And it can only do that through an effective use of freighter and passenger aircraft. So the role that air cargo plays in traditional economy in terms of a critical role has been accentuated and even more critical during the last 7 months that we've been dealing, or the world has been dealing, with the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. It's not only been a lifeline for the industry, which, as Brian again illustrated so perfectly, which has been going through financially very troublesome times, and that turbulence, both from an aviation perspective and a global perspective, will continue for some time. But there's also a significant role that air cargo has been playing as a lifeline for global society in transporting PPE, in transporting medical items around the planet. Next slide, please. But it's also been suffering from a significant number of challenges. And as we can imagine, as the world has gone into lockdown at different degrees of severity, dealing with local and national pandemic outbreak volumes, that's also meant that there's been a difficulty sometimes in getting qualified staff to the airport to help offload the cargo, to process it through the facility. And because cargo is very precious and it needs to be handled in such a critical manner, it also means that certain training validity requirements, which would otherwise have expired, we've had to work with the regulators to ensure that the staff can continue to operate with valid certificates. There's been a significant number of challenges in addressing closed airspace, closed airports, crew restrictions. As countries have implemented quarantine procedures and restrictions and obligations on people returning to a country, they also applied initially to crew. So we worked very closely with a number of international regulatory agencies, ICAO and their regional associations, to help ensure that the critical role that air cargo plays can be communicated effectively to the regulators to help ease the ability for the air cargo operations to continue in a seamless fashion. And we've been very pleased with the way that crew restrictions have been maintained, in the sense that the crew flexibility has been there, but adhering to certain restrictions that facilitate them doing their work, but in a safe and secure environment. We've also been exposed of where perhaps some inefficient processes existed when carriers were applying for ad hoc charters into and overflying particular countries, critical for when it's about transporting PPE, which is personal protection equipment, which has been vital for frontline medical workers around the world. And in fact, all of us, to protect ourselves, and air cargo has been not just a key supply chain, it's been the only supply chain moving that critical equipment around the world. So it's been a hugely large challenge to actually overcome some of the border restrictions, and again, working with customs and other officials and civil aviation authorities to make sure that the permits have been issued in a quick fashion. But again, has been mentioned both by Brian and myself, capacity has continued to be the biggest challenge that the industry has faced. And the industry has actually responded to that in quite an innovative way when you consider that 2/3 of the passenger fleet has actually been grounded, which is about 16,000 aircraft. So to actually try and use a little bit of the efficiency, sorry, next slide, please. To actually use some of those grounded aircraft in an innovative fashion, about 2,300 passenger aircraft have actually been dedicated for cargo-only operations. Now, this again has required some involvement from the regulatory authorities. When an aircraft is certified for passenger transport, it's pre-certified to carry cargo in overhead bins, under the seats, and in approved stowage areas within the cabin. If an airline wants to actually use the seats to store cargo, as this picture demonstrates, it would require additional certification from the regulatory authority. And there have even been some additional innovations where there's been somewhere in the region of about 150 aircraft out of those 2,300 passenger aircraft that have actually been dedicated to flying cargo-only operations. About 150 of them have actually had the seats fully removed to provide even further and greater cargo volumes. Now, they've had to secure that, so they've had to install some specific and unique tracking systems that the cargo can be safely secured to. But again, we have to say that it's been a great collaboration between regulators in the industry to get the appropriate approvals certified and issued in quick fashion. Next slide, please. But we now turn our eyes to the next challenge, which is the role that aviation can play in vaccinating the world. And when you look at various studies, if there is just a single dose vaccine that's produced that will need to be nearly 8 billion doses and distributed around the world, the volume of that size of shipment would fill 8,000, in fact more than 8,000 747 cargo aircraft. And that's just on the assumption that there is a single dose. If there is multiple doses, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, that the programs are still under development, then you can see that there will be a considerable burden on the aviation sector to help play the role in transporting these critical commodities around the planet. And if we go on to the next slide, please, we can talk about some of the challenges that the industry will face. First and foremost, you have to look at the condition upon which these vaccines will need to be distributed. A vaccine is one of the more sensitive cargoes that can actually be transported. And if they are, as it were, what we would say is a conventional vaccine, then it would need to be transported in a temperature range of between +2 and +8 degrees Celsius, which already is quite a sizable challenge when you consider the various temperature changes, both in processing the cargo through perhaps an airport, then on board the airplane at 39,000 feet in the air upon arrival, and then local distribution. So it's critical when moving something as sensitive as that there are the right facilities in place. That, I said, is conventional. If there is a vaccine which requires a more stringent temperature control environment, that could be as low as -80 degrees Celsius. In other words, transporting the vaccine in a frozen state. And then when you add the scale of the distribution to the magnitude of the challenge of the need for those facilities, you can understand where the industry needs to start preparing now, together with governments and the manufacturing industry as well. We know through a number of WHO coordinated programs which are looking at potential vaccines that there are up to 250 different programs under development, with about 9 or 10 at more advanced stages. And of course, once a vaccine is produced, then it's important and imperative that they look at safe distribution, and in fact even distributed manufacturing, to try and alleviate the global distribution, to try and manufacture in as many different sites around the planet as possible. But even with that, there will still need to be considerable focus on Africa, Latin America and Southeast Asia, where there isn't the potential for production. So some of the key considerations that the industry will need to look at, in collaboration with governments, with UN agencies, with other entities which are very active in this area, such as Gavi, as well as the manufacturers, airports, and all other security and safety agencies to make sure that there are facilities both at the airport on departure, airport on arrival, and more importantly, facilities distributed throughout the supply chain. It's also important that border processes are looked at. The cargo, such as vaccines, need to be processed quickly. The permits for the flights need to be processed quickly, because as we said before, that with about 2/3 of the commercial aviation fleet grounded, and as Brian had mentioned in his presentation, in traditional times, air cargo utilizes passenger capacity for about 50% of the cargo that's moved around the planet. This facilitates the access to the 24,000 city pairs that the passenger industry has built up over the last few years pre-COVID. And with the situation being some years back to normality, it means that the air cargo industry is going to very much need to rely on ad hoc charters, passenger aircraft used for cargo-only operations, as well as Brian said, perhaps the slow start-up of the passenger services wherever possible to distribute the vaccine as long as it can meet the temperature requirements necessary. So it's important there's no hold-ups for those permit applications, no hold-ups for the border for the approval and the clearance of the cargoes, and also that there are adequate staff in location at both export and import locate stations to process the cargo in a quick, expedient fashion. Supply chain integrity, I've mentioned a little bit previously, but this is critical. This is really talking about the vaccine as it leaves the production manufacturing site has to be maintained in an integral condition in a safe temperature range throughout the entire journey to point of ultimate distribution, wherever that may be. And if you think about the entire planet needing to be vaccinated, then you can just imagine the scale of making sure that throughout that chain, the temperature range is adhered to and maintained, which is why it's imperative that all of the parties need to get together and work together so that the vaccine can be distributed in the condition where it can actually work. Now, we've put security here because the vaccines themselves are an incredibly valuable commodity. Valuable in the sense that to manufacture 8 billion of these, the industry can't afford to lose, to have loss, to destroy, to have an accident. Sadly, theft is a concern. All of these issues need to be taken into account to make sure that the product integrity is critical. And when you consider that there are probably 200 potential territories and countries throughout the planet with varying degrees of safety, with varying degrees of land-based infrastructure, there will need to be some highly collaborative solutions that will need to be implemented. And again, as we've mentioned on numerous occasions, it's critical that we actually have that capacity there as an industry. So we urge governments to work consistently with each other to help the aviation sector in general with the restart process. It's imperative that there is harmonization and alignment and implementation of the CART regulations, which will facilitate a safe return to passenger transportation, because a passenger network is critical to support the cargo network when it comes to distributing the vaccine. And the last slide addresses one of the questions that I've just raised. Next slide, please, which is regards to the facilities. So IATA has actually developed and will be launching in the next coming days what we call IATA OneSource. And this will be the first time that the industry will actually have the availability to have complete visibility across the supply chain about people's capabilities and facilities. It will be independently validated. So if you are operating, or if an airline is operating a service to a new country and wants to know what is the condition or what are the facilities, does it have safe temperature environments, can it store perhaps in the more stringent environment if needs be, then the OneSource will provide that ability for partners, and that can also be the industry collaborating partners that we're working very closely with COVAX, with the Gavi Institute, with UNICEF, with the World Food Programme. They have a logistics cluster, and these are all great agencies which are doing tremendous work, and it's important that we as an industry can supply them with the needed infrastructure to help them. And with that, I say thank you very much, Tony. Back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. and we've got a few in the queue already. So the first question is concerns Europe, and it says in Europe, more and more airlines are canceling their passenger flights due to travel restrictions. How will this affect the cargo business, especially the yields for Europe?
This is a real problem. The travel restrictions, the closure of borders to passenger aircraft, is the major cause of, well, it's the cause of the shortage of capacity that we're seeing in the cargo business. The resurgence of the coronavirus in many European states is the cause of the closure, the renewal of some of the travel restrictions. So I think it's imperative that we resolve this problem in the absence of a vaccine, an effective testing regime. Because Europe is not where most of the freighters are. The cargo business will depend on a resumption of passenger services. So there's a constraint on the ability of European airlines to serve the needs and the demand for air cargo in the absence of being able to use their passenger services.
Brian, I think this question is also for you. Do you have any idea how the industry performed in August versus July's 13.5% down on previous year?
Well, we know from first of all, we know that from the data on flights that we saw continued growth. Actually, not so much on the passenger business. We actually saw renewed issues in August from the resurgence of coronavirus cases and more travel restrictions. But certainly from the orders for cargo that have been coming through, the export orders, that certainly points to more strength in cargo demand. So certainly if the capacity was actually there, and certainly there was some question mark on the passenger aircraft in August, there should certainly have been some further improvements. And we would expect to see significant further improvements in volumes over recent months for cargo. It's a very different market to the passenger business at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Digging a little deeper, we have a question about the year-on-year increase that you mentioned for Trans-Pacific traffic. What is driving that?
Yeah.
Is it purely China being up and running? And why is that performing better than Asia to Europe? And why are freighters being focused on the Trans-Pacific market?
Yeah, I mean it's partly trade. Actually, what we're seeing, what we saw with U.S.-China trade in July is that it was more or less where it was last year. It was down a little bit less than 1%. U.S. exports were up quite significantly. That's not the case with U.S. trade with Europe. So with Germany, trade in July was down 13%. So it's partly, the demand for air cargo, but that only explains, I think, part of the difference in the traffic volumes. I think it's also a capacity issue. Pre-crisis, the majority of freighters were concentrated. A large number of freighters were in the Pacific market. I think pre-crisis, 75% of traffic was carried by freighters, compared to something less than 50% carried across the North Atlantic, and certainly that's the case within Asia, where I think only 30% of traffic of cargo was carried by freighters before the crisis. So it's partly that's where the fleets are deployed, and it's also partly a reflection of the trade flows. But I think the important issue is really the fact that we're very short of freighter capacity, and the continued restrictions on passenger services is, as an unintended consequence, is limiting the ability of the industry to serve cargo demand.
Brian, just a precision on that. There's a question asking what specifically is included in what you call the North Pacific market.
Right. Okay. So that is all. Those are the what we would call the segments flows. So these are cargo ton kilometers flown between Asia and between North America. So that doesn't include any flows to Latin America.
Great. Question for Glyn. You talked about the industry's preparation for transporting vaccines. What exactly are we doing? Are we working locally to try and get local preparations ready, or are we holding meetings on a global level to try and prepare the airlines? How are we approaching that?
Right, a great question. We're actually, because of the scale of the challenge, we're working across many fronts. We have already commenced with a large number of meetings with various UN agencies. We participate on a weekly call with the World Food Programme and UNICEF and other aid agencies with regards to the logistic cluster. We've engaged with numerous pharmaceutical manufacturers who are at advanced stages so that we can actually assess the status and the readiness as it's progressing, also with a number of associations that represent the manufacturing industry. We're also working with our airlines in terms of global facilities and with ground handlers and with airports about readiness. We've also encouraging as much as possible local communities, and I'm just going to make reference to Frankfurt Airport community. They've already commenced, as it were, local coordination with regards to what they feel they need there as well to make sure that they have situations in place, because the scale of this doesn't just impact, as I say, the developing nations, it impacts all nations. And we have a number of carriers. Air France KLM have instigated already a significant amount of work looking at their African network, for example. So I would say that we're actually encouraging discussions at all levels, and we are just trying to facilitate right now the questions that need to be answered, what needs to be in place, and then we can actually collectively as an industry and as a community say how it's best addressed.
Okay, thanks, Glyn. I think this question might be for you as well. It talks about conversions. We've already seen a number of conversions from passenger to freighter aircraft because of the surge in demand. Do you expect that to be a long-term trend? And how do you see that evolving over, say, narrow-body versus wide-body aircraft?
Again, a great question. I'm just going to use slightly different terminology because what we've seen right now is reconfiguration. A conversion is much more of a long-term commitment. It's when a passenger aircraft is perhaps 15 to 18 years, which is the typical life expectancy of a passenger service. And then that aircraft, if it is deemed good for cargo operations, may be considered for a full conversion into a cargo freighter aircraft. So what we're seeing right now, which is a reconfiguration, because of course it's still limited by the door. So if you take the seats out, or even if you leave the seats in, the cargo can still only be loaded box by box by box into the passenger cabin. So we have seen these reconfigurations, both in wide body and narrow body. Traditionally, you would assume that it would make more sense, for example, a 777-300, which is an incredibly cargo-friendly aircraft in passenger configuration. You can get a good 30 to 40 tons in the belly. When you take the passengers out, you can get 55 tons in the belly, perhaps even another 10 to 15 in the passenger cabin. So they, in a reconfigured environment, offer tremendous capacity. But we've also seen A380s, which have been used on a couple of occasions for cargo-only operations. A significant number of 321s where the passenger seats have been removed and you can get 20 to 25 tons on a 321, which again comes back to perhaps the shorter haul question that was raised before. If you need to move some medical equipment around in very quick order of fashion and quicker than perhaps using the roads. So, and as Brian illustrated, if you anticipate that the passenger return to normal volumes won't be for another 3, 4, 5 years, depending on what forecasting you're looking at. Aircraft are designed to fly. The cargo industry is designed to connect the world and help manufacturers and consumers with the effective business that people want to engage in. Air cargo is also a significant enabler to support the UN sustainability goals by helping developing nations get usually their fresh fruits, vegetables, flowers up to more, as it were, the developed nation markets. So it's critical that before the passenger, or whilst the passenger network is returning to its pre-COVID situation in terms of connectivity and aircraft operations, that yes, indeed, we do anticipate seeing a significant number of passenger aircraft dedicated for cargo-only operations, both from a perspective to enable and help the industry get through this difficult time, but more importantly, to help the global society in dealing with the pandemic and the economic resurgence and reopening as it occurs.
Great, thanks very much, Glenn. We have a couple of questions that are looking, I suppose, beyond the immediate crisis. What future shape, do you see a change, I guess, to the shape or structure of the industry post-COVID crisis for cargo? What might the challenges for that be? And is there any impetus in what's going on now to help move forward the digitization of the air cargo industry? So maybe those are all questions for Glenn.
Great, thank you, Tony. Again, a great series of questions. Certainly with regards to digitization, absolutely. We have seen an acceleration just in the last few months driven by two different factors. Factor number one is people don't want to share a pen when they sign for a piece of paper, and people don't want to hand over pieces of paper from one individual to another. So we've actually seen a lot of people turn away from physical handing over and interactions in that way, even waiting around in cargo reception areas. We've had to introduce social distancing, lines on the ground. People have had to queue outside, limited number of people in the building. People have been sitting in their cabs longer. So the process of dropping off and collecting cargo, which does require interactions of people, has been encountering the same challenges that we all have in terms of normal way of life. So it has instigated a larger and, as it were, a more rapid acceleration in some of the digitalization mechanisms and procedures. So we would anticipate that things such as One Record, which is designed to exchange information in a much more rapid fashion rather than wait for the complete picture, will also help in terms of advanced clearance. Because what this crisis has also taught us is that cargo that sits on the ground in a warehouse doesn't help anybody. Whether or not that is pharmaceuticals, whether or not that is fresh flowers, or whether or not that is food and perishables, or whether or not that is manufacturing goods, cargo is designed to be moved. So if we can automate, if we can digitalize, if we can improve the processes to get that cargo moving quicker, then the industry will help to be reshaped going forward. Other areas that, in terms of a longer perspective, and I think this is something that the entire aviation sector will need to be looked at, which is what lessons can we learn? How can we prepare for the next eventual situation, whatever that may be in a global crisis impacting the industry? I think it's transparency of information. Certainly, I think a more coordinated global approach. One of the biggest challenges, interestingly enough, when you look at the fact that this is a global pandemic impacting every corner of the planet, and yet the country coordination, whether or not that is in crew quarantine restrictions and processes we talked about before, information exchange, approval of procedures, every country has done something different. And we're even seeing that in Restart. And this is hampering things. So we actually need much more global coordination going forward with matters which impact particularly aviation, which is a global industry. So I would say going forward, greater role for collaboration and cooperation and transparency, and certainly digitalization will be accelerated.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. We have a question that digs maybe a little bit deeper on that, and particularly digitalization, also customs and border clearances. What is IATA doing specifically to try and speed up border and customs clearances?
Again, some very good questions. Well, since the beginning of the outbreak, we participate very, very actively in a series of public and private consultative groups with the World Customs Organization, for example. And the WCO have been and were very quick in publishing guidelines that at the very beginning of this to their individual member states, raising awareness and the need for fast and effective clearances and highlighting the issues. We also worked very closely with the WCO and said that as our members were reporting particular blockages in the country, can we utilize the WCO mechanism to try and expedite those clearances? Because when it comes to things like face masks, it has a little bit more of an important critical factor than, for example, other commodities that may not be quite so life-saving. But a face mask that's being held up in a warehouse at a border is not being distributed or delivered to the hospitals and the clinics, which is needed to protect lives. So the WCO were incredibly responsive. In fact, they put together a list of emergency contacts throughout their entire, I think it's 172 member states. I could be wrong with that number, but it's certainly a significant number, whereby any issue that arose with blocked shipments, they were actually able to address that directly in very quick fashion. So I would say, again, very important and effective response times that were raised there. We also had other challenges when it came to not just border, but capacity from existing vaccination programs. For example, the Pan American Health Organization, UNICEF, and the WHO had published a study to say that since the outbreak of COVID, they've had to suspend a number of their traditional planned vaccination programs, which were designed in addressing the continued eradication of smallpox, measles, etc., from wherever they exist around the planet, as well as looking at diphtheria, cholera. When those programs have had to be suspended, quite often because lack of availability to get the cargo where the vaccines were produced into the local distribution sites, but also the inability for those volunteers to fly out to those distribution sites, has also shown that this is an area where we've needed to work together very closely. So where we've heard of these challenges, the industry is trying to respond by putting on capacity and working with border agencies to get that cargo flowing as quickly as possible.
Great, thanks, Glenn. I have a few questions for Brian. So one question is on revenues, and it's got a couple of parts to it. So one is, how do you see the evolution of cargo revenues between 2020 and 2021, and also compared to 2019? And then with respect to an airline's own revenue split, how do you see the passenger cargo revenue split changing between 2019, 20, and 21?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For much of this year, the cargo revenues have been driven by the higher yields that the capacity shortage have driven. I think we're now entering a phase where it's going to be much more driven by the rise in volumes as economies come back to life, and we see this sort of V-shaped rise in business confidence. I think we'll see cargo volumes rising. It looks to us as though we are going to see some positive growth in revenues 2021 over 2020, and the background for the industry will be, passenger revenues will be rising at a much slower pace. So whereas pre-crisis cargo represented about 15% of airline revenues, and that had been a declining proportion over the last, certainly over the last decade, for the industry as a whole, it could be 20-25% of revenues. Now, that's within a smaller airline revenue total. Nonetheless, clearly cargo much more important than it has been in the past. And at an individual airline level, I think we're already seeing the importance of cargo on some existing long-haul services in the absence, where load factors of passengers are very low, and particularly the absence of the business traveller who had previously driven the viability of that route. Cargo is filling the gap. And certainly for airlines in some regions like Asia, obviously a lot of cargo originates from Asia, where a lot of the manufacturing and assembly takes place. Clearly that's more positive news for airlines in that region. So I think there are some very helpful developments that will come out of cargo over the next 18 months. I should stress, though, it's still 25% of revenues where the passenger market is still so weak, is not going to make the difference to most airlines, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Maybe just for clarity, you to put that in context, the expected industry losses for next year.
So at the moment, our forecast that we issued in June was that we still think the industry will be making losses in 2021 in the region of $15 billion.
Great, thank you, Brian. A couple of regional questions. So how do you see the market in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, performing?
Air cargo is particularly important. I think we've already heard it mentioned. Air cargo is particularly important in serving the fresh produce and the flowers market that is generated by many African economies. It's a really important source of export earnings and jobs in those economies. The fresh produce shipped to Europe in particular, but also to other markets. I think given that what we're seeing in the world is a collapse of the traditional commodity markets that many African economies depend on, with the falling commodity prices, I think these cargo revenues, these cargo services supporting horticultural industries are going to be critical to support livelihoods in Africa.
Okay. Sticking with the regional theme, we have a question from Latin America. And the questioner noted that we see the Latin American market actually shrinking to smaller than the African market. So the question is really, what do you see as the outlook for Latin American cargo?
Yes, commodities are another issue for Latin America. Many of the economies there are dependent on commodities, but for the industry, cargo has been particularly important. Also, there's fresh produce is particularly important in that region. There's a real challenge, I think, in Latin America with obviously control of the virus. We're still seeing substantial increase in cases in many instances. And also the lack of support from governments to airlines. This is the one region where we have seen some either airline failures or airlines under bankruptcy protection. And so I think that in itself could risk there being a shortage of capacity as airlines are tied up in these sorts of proceedings.
Okay. Looking at it or slicing it a little bit differently, we have a question about international versus domestic. Mm-hmm. And how important are those two markets to cargo?
Yeah.
And do you see any differential in their performance during this crisis?
Yes. We've actually seen strong domestic cargo growth in North America, and I think a lot of that is driven by e-commerce, and that's one of the positive developments that has been driving the air cargo business. And I think the byproduct of the coronavirus is that e-commerce has become a bigger part of many people's lives and has probably accelerated the trend that we've seen towards people using these services. And obviously, consumers have an expectation of rapid delivery. Air cargo is really, in many instances, the only way to do that. So we're seeing strong domestic air cargo driven partly by those e-commerce trends. Internationally, e-commerce is starting to have an effect, but I think most of the flows are still being driven by the more traditional markets in electronics and fashion. And that, of course, is being constrained by the lack of passenger capacity because of the border closures.
And the question about the relative proportion, so how important is the domestic market versus the international market for cargo?
It really varies enormously by country.
Yeah, fair enough. Glenn, maybe some questions for you. We have a question on vaccine delivery. And the question is, what do you see as the main bottlenecks in the air or weaknesses in the current system? And what are the plans to mitigate or minimize those weaknesses? And I guess the other element of that is, how commercially important is delivering vaccines going to be to the industry?
Okay, great. Well, there's two parts of that. I think the first part of where we initially see the biggest challenges, and I'm going to make a reference to what Brian said a moment ago about e-commerce. I mean, e-commerce, the biggest challenge has been final part of delivery. And with the vaccine situation, I think that is where in our initial assessment, is where we see the need for greatest focus. Is the airline industry, together with its freight forwarding and airport partners and ground handling partners, have already got a very well established, as it were, cold chain solution or controlled environment. IATA has a program called CEIV, but there's also GDP, there's other validations and verifications in place. A lot of the equipment manufacturers, Envirotainer and others, have some great equipment to ensure that the cargo can be actually transported in a safe temperature controlled environment. So from factory to airport, from airport to airport, right up into the point upon clearance at destination, we feel that there are good, adequate procedures in place. Now, we do need to scale those up because, of course, right now they do not adequately cover the entire planet, but at least we've got a good basis to actually look at how we could build, as an industry, hub and spoke components to that particular part of the transportation. The challenge will really be, once the cargo is cleared at destination and through to where it needs to be finally distributed. And I'm sorry to keep belaboring the point, but if you take the continent of Africa, which cargo would probably, in a traditional, be about 90% moved on passenger bellies of the aircraft, where the passenger services international have been so dramatically curtailed during the current crisis. If a vaccine were to be distributed today, and of course it's not ready today, but there would just be no way of distributing it throughout the continent. Impossible. The continent is too large, too many borders. You can't use road transport, you can't use ocean transport. So it does require a very intricate, well-planned, logistical, almost to military precision, to actually look at where the cargo can arrive in safe conditions and put the preparations in place. Now, those preparations, and this is just an early assessment, would require cool facilities at various staging points throughout the continent. Now, it could be regional, it could be national, it could be based on geographical location of populations and demographics, but you would certainly need to have a big network of cool storage facilities, which then would be used in the distribution of the pharmaceuticals, so that they ultimately could move from cool storage facility to cool storage facility until they would actually then need to be, as it were, dispersed and distributed on a very local level. So that is, I think, our initial assessment of one of the most significant challenges that needs to be overcome. And sorry, I forgot the second part of the question, Tony. Commercial importance.
How important is that?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the airlines that we've spoken to, it's at these times when you're moving something as sensitive to this, Brian's already touched upon the commercial situation of the industry. Airlines will be looking to move the cargo in the most safe, protective environment possible. They want to make sure that there's adequate capacity to move it, and they want to make sure that the chain of custody, as the cargo leaves the carrier's possession, is handed over to the next partner in the chain, is in exactly the same condition as it was when it came into the air cargo supply chain. Airlines have invested over just the last 2 or 3 years tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on cool facilities. Many of them will never see a return on that level of investment, but it is the right thing to do to ensure that these most sensitive of commodities can be transported for the betterment of society.
Thanks, Glenn. We have another question, also sort of digging in the same area. When you say 8,000 plane loads full of vaccines, that sounds like an airlift. Are you expecting this to be in a short period of time, say over 2 weeks, or spread over a much longer period of time, in which case the intensity would be less? And then in terms of the freighters that are out there and capable of doing temperature-controlled shipments, is there sufficient capacity out there? How many of these types of freighters are there?
See, and again, a great question. That's exactly the type of question. We were using the illustration of the more than 8,000 747s to illustrate the magnitude of the size that we're talking about. When you consider the little glass vials of a vaccine, it needs to be in a proper shipped box so that they are protected from each other. They are very secure. They're very well packaged, and they are quite bulky in terms of the size that they actually take. You don't just throw these vials into a box and get 10,000. You get quite a small number in a box because they have to be protected. So the real question is how would we do it? And airlift is the correct phraseology. It would be some form of global airlift needed. And there are, again, many questions associated with this. How many different manufacturing sites will actually have the appropriate recipe and the ingredients to be able to manufacture the approved vaccine? Will it be one vaccine? Will it be multiple vaccines? As long as the vaccine is designed and approved under WHO guidelines, then of course it will be reciprocally recognized in states, which will then help passenger transport movements, etc. So when you factor in the scale of which manufacturing takes place, these things do take a while to actually produce. You then have to assume that will be a phased approach, just from the fact that it would make no sense to manufacture 8 billion vials of vaccine, have them stored in mega warehouses, and then say, right, we need to distribute them to the world on day 1 or day X. That just doesn't work. It's more a case of once the vaccines are approved, produced and approved, I would then anticipate that there would be a WHO or certainly UN agency coordinated with Gavi, who of course are experts in the area of Global Alliance with regards to vaccinations, to look at those agencies to identify and devise an effective distribution mechanism which can enhance the global vaccination process, which is really what the objective here is, to vaccinate the planet. But do it in a phased fashion, so you wouldn't do one country down in the bottom left of the globe and the next one in the top right, and then effectively try and work towards. You would need to do it in a much more coordinated fashion. And that's where I think the aid agencies have got incredible expertise about doing that type of distribution. And we as the industry, and I say we, that's collectively for the airports, the airlines, the ground handlers, the freight forwarders and the truckers, would then work with those agencies to ensure that we can deploy the capacity and the services where needs be for the distribution as per the agency's devised plans.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. We have a question about how different this is from the current capacity that the industry has. So, for example, how much how many vaccines or temperature-controlled shipments does the industry handle in normal times, and how does that compare to what we're anticipating will need to be handled with the potential airlift of a COVID-19 vaccine?
A good question. We don't actually have I don't have to hand the exact number, but I think there is one significant difference, which is today it is planned. So these are coordinated vaccination programs by the UN agencies, whether or not it's UNICEF, WHO or Gavi, which is obviously one of the major players in this area. These are planned vaccination programs where the vaccines are ordered in advance from the manufacturers. Many of these are in India, for example, or China, but I'll just use India as an example. They know the date of the application, they know the date of the distribution, they know the planning purposes for the cargo, they can determine the capacity needs be. In most cases, for planned vaccination programs, the quantities are not huge because they are planned and dispersed over a period of time, regularized. So therefore, they can quite often fit comfortably in the available passenger belly capacity. So and I keep reiterating the word planned. So in today's planned environment, the industry has responded incredibly well. It has, as I say, already the procedures in place to handle a small number of shipments, as it were, in planned conditions. And the industry has improved through certain validation programs over the last few years in terms of the number of incidents has come dramatically down. You see a number of coordinated trade lanes. You see a number of airports that have taken the lead in introducing and investing in the facilities, a number of carriers and freight forwarders who've built global networks around the ability to move very sensitive cargo in temperature-controlled environments. So collectively, the industry has, thankfully, the good basis of these procedures. So we know the procedures work. Now what we have to do is scale them up to the magnitude that's going to be required.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. I guess a more general question. If we look at how the industry is investing in things like handling infrastructure, change programs, etc., are those investments continuing even during the pandemic, or has a lot of that activity been frozen?
I think the answer to this, it's not a simple answer of a yes or a no. I think what we have seen in many cases is that the airlines have continued to invest. In fact, we are even talking, just as a matter of yesterday, our experts that deal with the safe transport of animals and also perishable cargo was already talking to an airport in Africa who would like to become the first one certified for the continent to move precious cargo. So even during the times of crisis, people are looking at the importance of investing in the future. And if you look at the whole area of special cargo, temperature sensitive and precious commodities, whether or not it's to try and reduce food wastage or move the vaccines or regular pharmaceuticals and medical supplies around the world, the industry is continuing to invest in those areas. I've also been very pleased to see that the investment in technology hasn't stopped. You would think that during times of crisis, all investments would cease, or many would cease, but we've seen an acceleration in some cases of people realizing that, as to your earlier question about the advancement of digitalization. So people are actually looking at this as a way to accelerate their longer term plans.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. We're running a little bit over, but we'll try and take another couple of questions before we close this off. We do have a question on OneSource, and the questioner asks, how far advanced is the service in terms of regional coverage, types of facilities that are covered, and what challenges do you see in trying to complete the project?
Great question. Well, it's actually being launched right now. So, we will be issuing some further information on that in the coming days. And already we have implemented, or we've inserted all the information related to the CEIV. So this is the independently validated experts around the world, entities around the world, whether that's airlines, freight forwarders, airports, etc. So they have already been implementing the system. We have also a mechanism where we're looking at introducing other certified entities with other programs that they've gone through. So the key is that the information in there will be validated and certified. So it's not just creating, as it were, a yellow pages directory where people can say, oh, I just want to find somebody somewhere. It will be validated information. So it's very comprehensive, a lot of information there. And we're working with all our regions to make sure that we can get all of the experts that have the facilities and the entities that have validated facilities implemented as quickly as possible. And through this mechanism, we shall be reaching out to a number of other entities, again, in preparation for when a vaccine will need to have globally distributed through effective partnerships.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. We have time, I think, for one last question, and we'll put that to Brian. It's a question about the Middle East carriers and their cargo performance, which seemed to improve in July. How do you see the trend for Middle East carriers and their cargo operations going forward? And what drove the improvement in July? Sorry.
Sure. Yes, I mean the Middle East airlines have featured very strongly, in the recent decade in developing, the cargo industry. They've used their services, hubbing over the Gulf region to serve cargo markets. We've seen a lot of growth there. Those passenger markets that hub through those countries obviously are very challenged by the current situation. So I think cargo is providing an opportunity for those airlines, and that I think is driving the growth that we've seen recently.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. With that, we'll close this press briefing. There are a couple of press releases that have gone out or are in the process of going out.
Yeah, should have gone out.
So be looking for those in your inboxes. One is on the vaccine issue, the other one is on OneSource. We have left in the queue a couple of very specific questions about India and South Africa. So we will try and get back to you individually on those questions. Thank you very much for participating.